First of all, I would like to thank Università ILM, Politecnico di Milano, and other sponsoring organizations for allowing me to be part of this monumental international conference for peace. I thank Professor Massimo De Giuseppe and his team for their efforts to make this event happen. My name is Satoko Oka Norimatsu. I'm one of the 3 coordinators of the International Network of Museums for Peace. I'm also an editor of the Asia Pacific Journal, Japan Focus, and English language progressive online journal, apjf.org, director of Peace Philosophy Center, peacephilosophy.com, and a co-founder of Vancouver Safe Article 9, a citizens group to uphold and promote the War Renunciation Clause of the post-war Constitution of Japan. Today, I'm speaking at my home in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on the traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today, December 10th, is the anniversary of the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, paying tribute to the preamble of the declaration that says, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of humankind. I would like to talk about 2 more important anniversaries around this day. One is the December 7th and 8th, the 80th anniversary of the start of the Japanese war against the Allied nations, and December 13th, the day to remember the 1937 Nanjing massacre. I was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, until I was 17 years old. Then I got an opportunity to attend the Lester B. Pearson College on the west coast of Canada, where 200 students from 70 countries and 5 continents lived and learned together. It was part of the United World Colleges network that also has a participating college, the Adriatic College in northeastern Italy, Duino. The most important thing that I learned at the Canadian College was a learning of what I hadn't learned back in Japan. And I learned it not in a classroom, but from my fellow Asian students. My friend from Singapore talked about the Imperial Japanese Army's bayoneting of young babies while the region was under the Japanese occupation. My friend from the Philippines told me that he was happy to find any nice friend from Japan. My friend from Indonesia surprised me by knowing the word Romusha. From the history of the Imperial Japanese Army mobilizing millions of Indonesian people for forced labor. These all happened during the 3 years and 8 months of Japanese invasion and occupation of those Southeast Asian countries. I was shocked and ashamed because I had not learned anything about that history at my school in Japan. Most Japanese children are taught to associate the notion of war with the history of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the incendiary bombings of about 100 cities across Japan in 1945. My father's house in Tokyo was burned down in the bombings of Tokyo. My maternal grandfather was conscripted to the war. My father was a student at the Naval Academy near Hiroshima, and he witnessed the mushroom cloud of Hiroshima atomic bomb. I grew up hearing those stories, and none of those stories that I heard from my fellow Asian students at my school in Canada. Education is a form of communication, but public education in many countries seem to communicate only the history that is convenient to those who have power. As I said, earlier this week was the 80th anniversary of the start of the Asia-Pacific War that broke out on December 8, 1941. How did the war begin? People in Japan, the United States, and much of the Western world learned that it began by the Japanese Navy's surprise attack on the US Navy base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Japan waged a hopeless war against a more technologically, militarily advanced country and lost as a matter of course. This is a mainstream war memory, and such narratives sweep across the mainstream media in Japan around this anniversary every year. Many seem to think that Japan only fought the war against the US and do not even think about other allied nations that eventually won the war against Japan, let alone China. Takashima Nobuyoshi, emeritus professor of the University of Ryukyu, says that this limited narrative of the start of the war is a cause of the general lack of wholesome understanding of the Asia-Pacific War. In fact, Japan waged that war against Western colonial powers, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, the United States, that controlled much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where Japan was seeking oil, minerals, food, and human resources in order to continue their ongoing aggressive war in China and cut the supply routes to support the Chiang Kai-shek government. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the multiple attacks, not even the first one. The first attack was on the Japanese Army's amphibious assault on Kotabaru, northern coast of British Malaya, on the early morning of December 8th, followed by the attacks on the Pearl Harbor about an hour later, different parts of Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Waikiki Island, Midway Island, and so on. This is where I could connect the dots between the limited education that I received in Japan and history of Japanese Army's aggressions that my friends from Singapore, the Philippines, and Indonesia told me about. While the majority of Japanese war memory centers around the war against the United States and what the Japanese suffers from the war damages, some who are more conscious of the aggressive nature of Japanese wars tend to use the framework of the 15-year war, the notion that philosopher Tsurumi Shunsuke came up with in 1950s. This refers to the period between September 18, 1931, the Japanese Army's false flag explosion of the South Manchuria Railway that paved the way to the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, and the subsequent full-scale war that erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing on July 7, 1937, and resulted in a Japanese defeat in August 1945. Historian Yamada Akira stresses, many Japanese people's perception of war and history converge on the war with the US, but we need to reconstruct our perceptions of war and history with the Japan-China war at the center. Some historians and journalists go further, citing the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-5, as the Imperial Japan's first full-scale war of aggression, calling the period of 1894 to 1945 a 50-year war. The Japanese victories of the First Sino-Japanese War and the subsequent Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5 led to the Japanese colonization of Korea and further imperial expansion in the continent, backed by the United Kingdom and the United States. Japan was a significant part of the eight-nation military intervention with China in the wake of the anti-imperial Boxer Rebellion 1900. Others cite that Japan's modern imperial quest started concurrently with the country's industrialization as early as 1870s. During the course of Japan's forceful annexation of the Kingdom of Ryukyu, now Okinawa, in a period, the first overseas military dispatch by modern Japan took place in Taiwan, 1874. In the following year, Japanese warships threatened the Kanhwa Island of Korea, marking the first military confrontation of modern Japan against Korea. Journalist Maruyama Shizuo therefore called the Imperial Japan's wars a 70-year war. Such historical understanding arises from the consciousness, one's choice to look at the country's history critically from the eyes of the people and the countries that were victimized by it. This is why I believe it is important for people in Japan to learn about the countless human rights violations during the over 7 decades of Imperial Japan's history of colonization and aggressive wars, such as colonization of and assimilation of Ainu lands and peoples, colonization, assimilation, and military exploitation of Ryukyus, colonial rule of Korea, and oppression of dissent, massacre of Koreans after Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, forced labor and military sex slavery from Korea, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, and other colonies and occupied areas, massacre of Chinese people in Malaysia and Singapore during the 3 years and 8 months of Japanese occupation, massacre, mass execution, rape, looting, arson in occupied areas, most notably the Nanjing massacre, the massacre of the 100,000 Filipino people and resistance fighters in the Battle of Manila, February 1945, biological warfare and human experimentation, including Unit 731, abuse and murders of Allied POWs and civilians in occupied areas. The list is endless, but for the sake of the memorial, I will talk about Nanjing massacre today. As Professor Massimo suggested, I wanted to have someone from the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall to speak today, but it didn't happen. So this is another reason why I feel the responsibility to commemorate the anniversary with all of you on behalf of the people of Nanjing and people of China. This December marks the 84th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre, in which hundreds of thousands of Chinese POWs and civilians were unlawfully and brutally massacred, raped, and deprived for weeks and months from the beginning of December 1937 till around the end of March 1938, under the attack and subsequent occupation of the Imperial Japanese Army. I have been to Nanjing twice, the first time in 2007, the 70th anniversary, and the second time in 2017, the 80th anniversary. In 2017, I went with a historical tour organized by Matsuoka Tamaki, a renowned researcher of the Nanjing Massacre. The word that she said in the tour bus that I cannot forget is that the Nanjing Massacre was large-scale and symbolic, but it was the only one of many, many similar brutal massacres committed by the Japanese army during the war, what she called Tsa'an. At 10 a.m. on the morning of December 13, pedestrians stop and close their eyes, drivers honk, and ships whistle. The whole city goes into mourning. We had opportunities to visit the survivors of the Nanjing Massacre too. They kindly welcomed the group of Japanese visitors. Historian of the Nanjing Massacre, Kazahara Tokshi, points to the fact that the air raids on Nanjing by naval aircraft, which began on August 15, 1937, were a prelude to the Battle of Nanjing, and indiscriminate attacks on civilians could be considered the start of the Nanjing Massacre. On August 15, 1937, 20 Mitsubishi G3M bombers of the Imperial Japanese Navy left the Omura airfield in Nagasaki, crossed the East China Sea, and attacked Nanjing. According to military historian Maeda Tetsuo, it was the first of such cross-ocean bombing mission ever conducted in human history, followed by the bombing of over 60s in China by mid-October. It was very ironical that Nagasaki, 80 years later, became the target of the cross-ocean bombing mission conducted by the United States, which was the atomic bombing of the city. It was like a historical boomerang. People in Nagasaki remember August 9th and their suffering from the atomic bomb, but hardly ever remember that Nagasaki was a launching point of the Japanese aggression against Nanjing, months prior to the well-known Nanjing Massacre. Much like the people of Hiroshima, or Japan in general, know the suffering from the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, but hardly ever care about the fact that Hiroshima and its militarism played major roles in the 7 decades of Japanese aggressions against fellow Asian countries. On the contrary, there are people who remember and commemorate the Japanese air attacks on Nanjing in Jeju Island, Korea. These people have been holding annual memorials for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre since 2014, just because Aljur Airfield in Jeju Island was also used for the Japanese aerial attacks against Nanjing. Korean people were victims of the Japanese colonial rule then, and bore no responsibility for the Japanese war atrocities. They were even put to forced labor to build those Japanese military facilities on the island. But the people of Jeju in the current time still feel their moral obligation to remember the massacre. I think we should humbly learn from this example of highest moral practice. Today, I talked about 2 December war anniversaries, symbolically, one before and one after the International Human Rights Day, which is today, and demonstrated the importance of critically re-examining and challenging the dominant historical narratives and the public education of one's country, and relearning and remembering the history in the shoes of the people whose human rights were violated. Thank you very much.